one of the most important things, and you know this, in your audience, knows it, but you gotta say it, is you gotta have your data in advance. And we focused obsessively on what are the ways we can continuously improve our process so that we know the types of data that's going to be important for the audit plan that's coming down the pipeline, so that we can invest in getting data, understanding it, profiling it before we even get into audit planning. Because if you do that, you're just off to a great start.
This episode is brought to you by Greenskies Analytics, an audit analytics service provider that works with internal audit departments that have data analysts and are still frustrated with trying to make analytics actually work, aren't getting the expected ROI, who can't break through the communication barrier between the analysts and the audit team, and those that need experienced direction for an audit analytics strategy and process. Those that feel like they've wasted time and money on trainings, aren't getting the value they want, not prioritizing the highest risk areas for the organizations, or have projects that seemingly never get completed. Do you deal with any of that? If you do, go to the show notes of this episode and click the Greenskies Analytics link, or go to greenskiesanalytics.com to schedule a call and understand how Greenskies Analytics makes analytics actually work for internal audit. This episode is brought to you by Supervisor. Supervisor is a ready-to-use audit analytics platform that integrates with your ERP and any other systems you have to provide actual continuous monitoring for risk across all your transactions. They have more than 350 out-of-the-box checks and analytics to enable your team to perform full population testing, detect multiple types of anomalies, and identify potential fraudulent activity. That's going to give you an unparalleled level of assurance in your financial processes. Built by internal audit and accounting experts, so your team can get value from the first day of usage. So imagine having no analytics today, walking in tomorrow, and having up to 350 audit analytics already run. You don't have to necessarily take my word for it, though. Global organizations such as IKEA, Michelin, Lacoste, and numerous others trust Supervisor to enhance their audit capabilities and increase their assurance.
This podcast is also brought to you by Audit Board, the leading cloud-based platform transforming how enterprises manage risk. Audit Board's integrated suite of easy-to-use audit, risk, and compliance solutions streamlines internal audit, SOX compliance, risk management, and security compliance. Automate processes and improve execution with Audit Board's purpose-built solution, which is designed to address the most pressing challenges of today's practitioners. Experience the latest in audit, risk, and compliance technology. Visit auditboard.com to schedule your product walkthrough to see Audit Board's award-winning platform in action today.
Hey everybody, before we jump into the show, I just want to let you know that the Audit Analytics and AI Conference is September 25th and 26th this year. It's all virtual, so no matter where you are in the world, you can absolutely attend. Recordings are also available, so if you are 12 hours away and don't want to be up at 3, 4, 5 in the morning, you can purchase the recordings. This is the only conference that's strictly about analytics and AI for internal audit. So you're going to get your practitioners' use cases. This thing is practitioner-led, save for one speaker that we had this year, but everyone else is in your peer group, ranging from the largest internal audit data analytics teams in the world down to the individual contributor who spends, hey, I got 50% of my time I can dedicate towards analytics. Each speaker mission is to show you how to actually do what they are talking about. So thought leadership is great, and there will certainly be some of that, but for the most part, that's great. We love the thought leadership. Show us how to actually do it. We are currently at 19 speakers and counting, so we're going to add a few more, and you can get up to 19 CPEs if you attend. Check out the link in the show notes, or you can search for Google the auditanalyticsconference.com, and you can register there. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Audit Podcast. I'm your host, Trent Russell. Today on the show, we have Mark Houston. He's a former senior manager from Deloitte, and then he moved to Capital One and just held a slew of positions relative to fraud, investigation, and analytics. And now he's a partner at the Audient Group, where they focus on strategic fraud prevention and detection solutions for government and private sector organizations. You'll hear it throughout the conversation, but if you fall into that category, reach out to Mark. He's cool. I recommend him. Some of the things that we talk about, probably through no surprise: fraud cases, to the extent that obviously Mark could disclose those, but everybody loves a good fraud story. And so we asked Mark about his top 2 favorite frauds that he's been a part of. And as much as we want to know fraud scenarios that are going on within our organizations, things to look out for, trends on those types of fraud scenarios, there's also the personal fraud side, and then the practical and tactical for mitigating elder fraud and protecting our most vulnerable customers. That's a brand new topic for the podcast, so I thought it was very interesting to learn more about that. We all have vulnerable customers that we work with our organizations, and so making sure that those are taken care of. We also talked data within internal audit and how to leverage data for audits. And then Mark wrote, when he left Capital One, he wrote a love letter to the auditors on doing more when he left. And so he kind of shares what was in that love letter and some kind of parting words for them. So with that said, here we go. All right, so what is in either or your internet browsing history or your ChatGPT history or Llama history or Claude history or any LLM that you might use? What's going on? What's going on in Mark's world?
Well, that's a great question. I'll answer a couple of them. One, I think I'm on the watch list for ChatGPT because in the early years, I searched a lot about how to steal money from banks. How do I steal a lot of money from Capital One? Just to see what it would yield in the way of tidbits that we could use to better, protect ourselves. So I'm still cautious with my expansion of ChatGPT beyond there. But internet browsing is filled with one of 3 topics right now. I'm planning a very quick vacation for my sister and I to go to a wedding in Scotland. I'm always trying to search who's got a track day event at Virginia International Raceway. And then I'm always nerding out on something, to do with culinary techniques. And right now that tends to be more coffee and how to make an Americano.
You're going to tell us what that is.
Yeah, an Americano is an Americano that has then been steamed. So it's an iced Americano that's been steamed and frothed and then put back over ice. So it's a lot like a nitro Americano, but there's no intentional addition of nitrogen into the bubbles.
That all made perfect sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, when I say nerd out, you're getting into very nerdy things there.
Yeah, I put the pot in, I push the button, I get black coffee, I put 2 ice cubes in it, and I just down it. That's the extent of my coffee expertise.
Yeah. I don't go too overboard, but
I don't know. That sounded pretty overboard, man.
I was advised by a barista once to try it, and have enjoyed building my capability in it.
All right. Hopefully, there's somebody else out there. I'm sure there's other coffee or caffeine nerds out there that will take that up and try it also. So I'm sure they appreciate that answer. All right.
Yeah, happy to share the technique.
And then I don't know if you're willing. So I know you're a race guy. And you're also an Ohio State football fan. So tying those 2 together, have you found any interesting ways to merge those 2 interests of yours?
Yeah, as luck would have it, I have a very themed racing helmet that I wear on track that is emulating a Ohio State Buckeye football helmet. Which serves 2 purposes. One, if I were to, run out of talent on the racetrack, it would protect me. But I find that it's really good at starting conversations when you're there with a whole bunch of people you don't know, and they see it and go, "Oh, are you from Ohio?"
Yeah.
So,
so if anybody's an Ohio State football fan or college football fan in general, or a racing fan, if you're listening to this through iTunes or Spotify or something like that, hop over to the YouTube version, the full video of this conversation. And Mark brought up the helmet and showed it off. So as someone who is a Alabama college football fan, not a huge fan of Ohio State, but even then, I think that's cool.
Yeah, and the voice of Alabama football used to also be the voice of NASCAR.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
That tidbit. Yeah.
He retired.
A little racing nugget.
Yeah, he retired this year. I forgot about that. I think that's where he kind of cut his teeth, was in the racing stuff. Yeah, guy's got a Eli Gold. He's got a wonderful voice. Like, I'm sure when he was like 18, somebody said, with that voice, like, just your career is going to be calling games or something, or calling races or something. It's
iconic.
Yeah, iconic. That's the word I was looking for. All right, perfect. All right, cool. All right, so let's jump into some of the other nerdier audit fraud type stuff. Knowing you're a fraud guy, I'm sure you have a lot of fraud stories, cases, things like that. And I think broadly, even if people weren't interested in necessarily audit, I think everybody loves a good fraud story. And so I was hoping you could share, to the extent you can, obviously if there's details you can't share, that's fine, but kind of your top 2 maybe favorite fraud stories.
Yeah. I spent a lot of my career focused on internal fraud, which just like sheds light on some really amazing stories. Some of the more interesting ones I'm not really allowed to share the details of. But the thing that I took away that was always the most interesting was how elaborate a fraud scheme could be to net such little amount of money, and how they would like throw away a career opportunity for just a little bit extra money. So we would always like silently golf clap those that went for the gusto and tried for the big amount. But I have a couple stories that I can tell that are a lot more interesting. The first one is quite a long time ago. We were a fraud investigation team, working for a retailer and working on behalf of a law firm working with the retailer. And they thought there was some fraudulent misrepresentation of accounts receivable, and quickly came to realize that there were, many tactics of how you could make accounts receivable look more current than they actually were. And one of the things that sticks with me is they had store managers that went as far as getting like delivery outfits from big name delivery companies so that they could go to customers' homes and impersonate the delivery service and try to repossess items, so that they could then come back and say, oh, the item was returned and that receivables been refreshed. But they also had another scheme where the purchases were on installment cards. So another tactic was having like add-on sales to the account, which would refresh the receivable. So an example of that would be like someone came in and bought glasses for $1,000, didn't pay their monthly balance for a while. You could call them and say, hey, like, why don't you come in and buy some $5 glasses cleaner on your account? And that'll make your account be current, and therefore look like the receivable is more current than it really is. And they weren't in the glasses business, but that was the best way to describe, like, the steps they would go to really, like, hide that their portfolio was a lot lower performing than what they wanted the banks and others to know. Another one that's like just fits in with a lifelong like career in fraud is there was an investigation of a company that was all about whether they were manipulating their credit card transactions so that they could avoid the chargeback processes that Visa and MasterCard have. And there's obviously two sides to the story that were both, plausible, but we used analytics to like set out a fact pattern of like the events that we know occurred and the actions that we know happened based on the analytics. And at that point, it then became like, well, what was the motivation and which side of this story, legally was going to hold? And so the individual that was responsible was being interviewed, and the interview followed this like recurring process of law firm asking a question, the individual having zero recollection at all of any of it. The law firm then coming back after looking at the data analysis and saying, well, we have example of this. And then the individual saying, oh yeah, well, like, here's my understanding of it. And it went on and on and on through the whole thing. And like what amazed that group and like what stuck with me was it was clear that the data had shown exactly the actions that were taking place. Yet the individual continued to deny and like act like he had no knowledge until the facts were like, again, back in front of him. And I think that kind of just set the tone of like a long career working in fraud where many times, you know, you're investigating people and they are lying, they're deceitful, they're telling you that they don't know or nothing happened or they didn't have the intent there when like in reality, like they're still the only one that really knows what ultimately was the motivation and why, you know, it took place. So
yeah, I thought you were going to go a slightly different way of finding that one when you said fact pattern. And this is just kind of one of my favorite cases, and or at least the technique we used to find it. I didn't plan on sharing it, but I do love this one. So we had this person had gotten busted. Like they knew they were caught and they said, yep, that one was fraudulent, that one was fraudulent, that transaction was fraudulent, etc. And I know just in talking to people like yourself and other fraud folks that even if you cooperate, the fraudster does, they usually don't have records so great that they can find 100% and go like, yep, here's every one of them. And so this was, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. But we knew we had this one was fraud, this one was fraud, this one was fraud. We don't know for these other 1,000 if they were or not, but we knew some were through their cooperation. And so I looked at it and I went, all right, that's basically a population we can use to predict of the ones that we don't know if they're fraud. We know which ones are, so we can apply a predictive model to those, the ones we don't know, and then get some kind of confidence level of like, yeah, we're kind of like 80-90% sure that this one is fraud and you should further investigate it. And so that was that's what we did. And from that, there was, I recall one in particular transaction. It was like, whatever, 88% chance that this one is fraudulent. And so sent it back to the audit team who passed it on to like the investigators or whoever it was. And they said, oh yeah, actually, she admitted to that one yesterday. And I went, cool. Like we got one, like I thought that was so cool. And I went, all right, look, now here's another 20 you need to go look at based on, what we ran. So that's kind of always been one of my favorite use cases is using the data, the population of ones we know are fraud to then predict which ones could also be fraud specific to that fraud case or that use case. But
yeah, I mean, I think applying it back into ours, we just got so lucky that we had, a pretty big population of data. And it was pretty quick for us to identify essentially a pool of credit cards that they had acquired from an offshore bank. And we're running like a stress testing program on their system of really low dollar transactions so that the ratio of transactions that were charged back, continued to change. Yeah. So whether it was a stress testing program because they were having problems with the credit card processing capabilities and customers being turned away, as one side of the story was, or it was a dedicated program to put low dollar transactions through until you could reduce your chargeback rate to just under the penalty level. Like, I don't know that I know how that landed in the court of law, but for us, it was easy to identify like a pool of cards that had a common transaction pattern all at the same time. And, if we needed to, we might have been able to predict like who else was in the pool with it. But we had enough evidence at that point to have the discussion of motivation versus finding every corner case of what they were doing as well.
All right. Well, you did not disappoint with the 2 fraud stories. Those were awesome. But I'm curious, I think a lot of us know about common, AP type stuff, or even some stuff that happens in the GL, things along those nature. We're all probably pretty familiar with that, especially on the AP side. But what about, is there any kind of trends that you're seeing both on the corporate side and on the personal side? Like me as an individual, I'm getting SMS fraud text or something, I get a ton of those, it seems like. So is there any trends like that we should keep an eye on for our organization and as well as for our personal lives?
Yeah, I'll first just hit like the work we do at Audient Group has a lot of work with the federal government. So we're doing a lot of like fraud, waste, abuse, just risk assessment, risk management programs that hopefully, like benefit everyone across the country that pay taxes, and having those taxes have the highest rate of use towards their intended use, not, someone else's coffers. So that's one area that we see continued focus is just the government focusing on how to continue to, fight fraud. On the corporate front, the biggest trend is just continuing to grow at a rapid rate. I don't have anyone in my network saying, "Hey, Mark, it's starting to slow down or it's declining. Like, what's happening?" So if I was an auditor, I would be really thinking about ways that you could, try to develop some insight around, the business and fraud, and how can you like share that insight to your, management and to the stakeholders you work with. Things that I encourage people to, think through are like, if your company's growing, but your fraud rate is not growing, like understand why. Is that because your like protection, department is so good? Or is it that like you're just not really identifying fraud and it's living somewhere else in some type of credit loss or just accounts payable that's going out and your account payable number is big, but you're not catching the fraud that's in it. The other thing is if you have data on the different like fraud schemes you're seeing, like how are they shifting over time? I think that's one thing that like in banking that we obsess about, because we have limited capacity and sometimes you're focused on first party fraud where there's not really a good customer there. But then third party fraud might flare up because of a ring that like has taken over a bunch of customers' accounts after a data breach. But like monitoring and just observing like how is the fraud like schemes that your company's exposed to like shifting over time, and does that make sense with like the investments that your company's making in strategy and like platforms in the future? So I think those are a couple of ways to think about it. And then maybe like just throw the lens on there of like, what's the impact to the customer based on those like fraud experiences? And that doesn't only have to be, in banking. It could be someone who is like artificially pricing products. So someone's just paying more for our service or anything else that they're consuming. So shifting from like, how does it impact the business to how does it impact your customers is also another thing that you can bring analytics to, and the auditors can sit down with like people in the business and have just an open discussion on that is trying to just gain insight, build learning, and where possible, maybe add some like nuggets back to their stakeholders on like what they see. On the personal front, yeah, I mean, you mentioned it, like not a day goes by that my phone isn't filled with all sorts of, texts from people I don't know, phone calls from people that I know aren't real. But the thing that has me like really curious right now and happy for anyone else to like chime in later and tell me about research they know of, but there's a scheme out there that I continue to get offered in my email that is free comfort pillows from Marriott. And if you go back in time, in 2018, Marriott had a data breach where this information was compromised. So, being someone who's had a lot of travel in my history, it's not a coincidence that I'm getting offered, comfort pillows from Marriott as one of the like most loyal customers.
Yeah.
So I really like am struggling to process, like, has it really taken from 2018 to now for fraudsters to use like breach data?
Yeah.
Or is it just like happening in other ways that I'm not aware of? But that seems to me to be a long time for that information to be available before I was like individually targeted.
Yeah, that is interesting, because you would think breach and then, couple days, weeks, maybe months, something like that, I would imagine you already have a fraud scheme in mind if you, are going so far as to steal something like that, and you would just, or I guess it's sold and it proliferates out. Maybe that takes a while before it gets to the ultimate fraudster that's going to commit that part of the scheme.
Yeah.
But even then, 4 years is a long time. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think the reality is Marriott's not alone, right? Every company is, well, not every company, but there's a lot of companies that have had breaches. So it's not a reference on Marriott. It's more just in general, when there is a breach, how fast can companies expect for that information to be used in a way that either harms customers or harms the company? And in this one, 4 years, has felt like a long time. The other thing that's really interesting, going back to the GPT, intro is, the emails I get are just comically bad and not believable. So they're clearly not using any GPT, capability to help them write a better email. So, I think my near term, not totally educated and investigated opinion is that criminals just still are at a relatively low level of maturity of bringing this to the market fast. But when they do, I think it's going to be a gigantic leap in their own capability that hopefully we're still ahead of when they get that, because right now I don't know that I've got evidence to say that they're using it in a highly effective way really quickly after the breach, has taken place.
You're talking about email schemes. I am a big fan of unsubscribing from emails, especially by personal email a ton. It's a daily thing. If I see something, I immediately scroll down, look for unsubscribe, hit it. Now Gmail has this option where it's it's part of the service. There's a button you can click within Gmail. On my work stuff, I basically sign up for every newsletter. It all goes to this one folder, and then I can just scroll through the titles and go, yeah, I'll look at that one today and that one. And so my inbox isn't as messy. But I thought for a while, I was like, you know what? A decent scheme would be send out fake emails, make the unsubscribe button the fraudulent piece of it, because you click on unsubscribe and then now they got you. So thankfully Gmail does, at least. I don't know if anybody else does. I'm sure they do. You don't have to go through that, but I would click it and then I would go, that might have been what they wanted me to do, was hit unsubscribe.
Yeah. I don't know whether they are or not, but I ebb and flow with my diligence of clicking unsubscribe. And the one thing that I can just tell you is it hasn't slowed down the volume of junk that comes into my email box. So I still will go through periods of let me try this and unsubscribe more. But I am very skeptical, thinking that sometimes I'm going to unsubscribe and all it's doing is taking me off one list and adding me to three more lists.
Yeah. So I don't know how Gmail handles that natively with that new option that I was talking about. I think it's maybe 3 or 4 weeks old-ish, maybe something like that. But I was a huge fan of it, and it's on mobile, so I can even just on my phone go, nope. So I love that feature. But
yeah,
all right. I know that elder fraud, abuse, etc., is kind of a passion of yours. When we first met and started talking about just fraud in general, you went in that direction a few different times, or maybe more broadly referred to as vulnerable customers. But what's the practical and tactical of mitigating elder fraud or vulnerable customer type fraud?
Yeah, I mean, you could do hours and hours and hours of how to get there. I'll try to summarize a couple key points here. I think knowing your audience as a high proportion of auditors, I just challenge every auditor out there to shine a light on it. It's not the perception of it is not a huge risk. The number of companies I talk to that, lump it in with a larger category, whether it's know your customer or AML or your fraud detection department, or others that are just yeah, Mark, that's not big enough for us to even really be focused on, is really, saddening. So if you're an auditor out there, one of the best things you could do is just think about how could someone of different ages that are customers either experience what your company offers differently because of their age segmentation, or receive pricing that's different because of their age segmentation. And think about like, what would elder abuse show up as in the context of like the company I work for? And I think you'll find almost every industry has some kind of version of that, because almost everyone's dealing with customers that are, from different age segments. Banking and financial services and healthcare and insurance, like they all inherently have some degree of focus here. But like, I'd still just like beg you to like dig into the data. And like the thing that I always try to like bring to bear is like, if I can do some type of like average cost to a customer of a service, and find like a very big differentiation as you like segment it by ages, like it's just a good question to say, well, why does that occur that way? You could look at it in your complaint volume. So are you getting a higher proportion of complaints from that population? If you're in a banking or financial services or like insurance, you could do, am I having more fraud claims raised? Am I in the frauds that we know are occurring? Like what's the average loss per event? And is that average loss per event, different for one segment, versus another one? But the key here is like, get some data and like bring it to life. Because like, not every company even thinks about like the segmentation of their customers. So one of the things we did at the beginning at Capital One was we just created a chart, and it showed what percentage of our customers were from different age segments, and then what percent of our deposit base was from different age segments. And like, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that like, there's probably a smaller population of really old people, but like the way savings occur, really old people likely have aggregated savings over their whole life, and they have a much more meaningful like portion of that population, which can be used to like monitor, okay, well, is there like risk of elder abuse? But it also like brought to bear some strategy things of like, well, as these people age out, if they don't have like children with accounts with us, is the estate going to transfer those deposits out of our ecosystem? And do we have to like worry about like attrition of deposits? So, using data to shine a light on it and just ask, where could it be occurring? Where is there information that we wouldn't feel comfortable sharing? In my example, I used to always say, I'm not comfortable sharing that with my parents. And having a discussion about it to like learn what the like facts behind it are, because until you're really experienced with the data you're using, you can jump to conclusions. So I always, felt like asking, hey, why does this make sense, was way better than, oh my gosh, we have a problem because I see this.
Yeah. I think when you look at data, I know, especially on a fraud front, it's super easy to see something in the data and go, fraud, nailed it, we're done. And then most of the time when you dig in, you go, well, no, it's just this one-off thing that actually wasn't the case. But aside from that, I like the way you have kind of naturally posed these risks as opportunities. And that's something I try to preach to people all the time, is like, your executives would much rather hear about an opportunity than they would a risk. Opportunity, positive, great, let's do it. Risk, negative, cost money, don't want to hear about that as much. And so even when you're talking about the age segmentation piece, there's an opportunity to look at it from the customer experience perspective and go, look, we have an opportunity here to change our, how we interact with customers, and maybe we retain more or obtain more or something like that. And phrasing it from an opportunity perspective, as opposed to, here's this vulnerable customer or elderly abuse risk that we need to address. And they're going to go, yeah, I mean, you're right. So yeah, I guess, we should do something about it. But if you look at it from the opportunity side and go, this is how we can retain or obtain new customers by doing this, then they are likely to be more willing to buy in on what that is. And you've done it twice. There's two different examples where it's a risk, but you framed it as an opportunity. And I thought that was fantastic.
Yeah. And, like, there's real operational considerations here. I mean, if you have a call center channel, or you intake calls, and you can kind of like segment what's the call duration difference? Like, you likely know what your cost per minute is, your cost per call is. And if you find that it's taking a long time to service those customers, that's operationally important to know. But on the flip side, you might have people that know, like, hey, I'm being held accountable to like an average of 10 minutes per call. They just picked up, they sound like they're elderly. This is going to be too long. It's going to hurt my metrics. So like, they hang up and go to the next call, right? Well, like, that's not the experience that you want, but it could be happening. And those are things that, like, if you were to step back and go, hey, we've done an analysis and our call hangups 90% of the time for our customers that are over the age of 50, that like probably doesn't like hit the radar of elder abuse in the way that anyone's going to look at it. But it can challenge you to think about it and say, we got to do better, because ethically, like, this would be very hard to substantiate if someone came in and said, why does that occur? And even if you have really valid reasons, it would still be uncomfortable to say 90% of the time we do that. So it's a great way to like go at it. And many times you're just creating a better outcome for your company, for your customers, and ultimately society writ large when we're, caring for that population better than we do today.
All right. I know you've mentioned analytics a few times, from some of the work you're doing now, some of the work you've done historically with internal audit also. And again, when we talked for the first time, you'd mentioned this love letter that you wrote to your auditors as you were leaving. So what was in that love letter? What was that about?
Yeah, I think, look, I think there's two sides of the story. And for some additional background, in my time at Capital One, I spent, time in all three lines of defense. So, I led our analytics team that supported auditors. I was in a compliance role, and then also was a frontline executive that was subject to audits. So when I left, I was leaving as a frontline leader that had feedback for the audit team, and they may not have thought about it as in form of like a formal love letter, but that was a good reference point. And I think there's a couple different components of it that I think are important. One, like, I wanted to emphasize to them the value of the work that they did and the value that I took away from the work that they did, because at the end of the day, it's not always easy to be in that, situation and play that role. But in a state where like they were the last like line of defense before we sat down with regulators and other external parties, knowing that they'd done the work that they did that provided, us further risk management, just was something that I took a lot of value from, and they needed to hear it from me, because I appreciated it. And I felt like it was important to tell them that, when I was leaving. But with many of them, I kind of like, added another piece to it, which was just feedback where I felt like, had they thought about some of the analytical strategies that I had tried to implement when I was in the like function of leading the audit, analytics group and other things, just where they had some missed opportunities, and had they done some foundational things a little bit differently, how that they could have been the ones that really helped spot things that, as a business we were faced with. And frankly, they would have done it earlier than we did. Like, it was great that we found it in the first line, but it was a little painful to know how long some of these things that, transpired for, and how many audits it cycled. So I was very direct in just like, hey, remember this thing that like was kind of an important thing that we found? Like, here's how you could have identified it as well and brought that back to us if you would have used data to like analyze this, or, think about the relationship that we had, not only as, hey, we're coming to audit you, but like, hey, we saw this thing through our monitoring tool. We just wanted to get your opinion on like, why would we expect to see that happen? And did you see the same thing in your monitoring? So, it was a great relationship, that we had. They did a tremendous job. None of that should be taken negatively, but like, I wanted them to know the value they deliver, and I wanted to like help them better see how they can continuously improve through the use of their, analytics and the company's data.
Continuous improvement is not a passion of mine, but I love that continuous improvement. Like I would love someone to come in every day at the end of my day and go, you did this great, you need to work on this. You did this great, you need to work on this. Like that's a dream scenario almost for me. So I'm sure they did appreciate that. But I'm also curious, what was like when you were running analytics and audit, how did you use data for an effective audit? And I know that that's a very broad question. So you can take it any way that you want to. For me, I always say if we're auditing against the organization's strategic objectives, I can't imagine a much better use case for analytics than if you have this control ties to this strategic objective. And if we're good on this control, we'll be able to meet those objectives. So we're going to use analytics to whatever extent, full population testing, outlier analysis, whatever, around that. Then to me, that's, what else could, to me, that's the best thing that we could possibly do, if that's the overall audit approach or internal audit strategy. But everyone's is different, but you have SOX, compliance, and that kind of stuff. So it's a little different. So again, all I'd say, it's a very broad question, but I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, you could apply it, kind of everywhere. And I think I'm going to narrow in and just talk about like the delivery of individual audits. To me is an area where I think there's still a lot of opportunity. There was a lot of where I focused in that, love letter as well, was like on individual type audits and an individual type view of data. So one of the like most important things, and this in your audience, knows it, but like you got to say it, is you got to have your data in advance. And we focused obsessively on what are the ways we can continuously improve our process so that we know the types of data that's going to be important for the audit plan that's coming down the pipeline, so that we can invest in getting data, understanding it, profiling it before we even get into like audit planning. Because if you do that, like you're just off to a great start. So we had all sorts of interesting like methods of things that we could do. Our auditors in charge could do, our like, audit managers could do, to like better help you have data, early, or before the audit kicks off. That to me is like number one table stakes. The next one is simple too, right? Like just profile your data and explore it. Some of the most simple things are often overlooked, yet can add like tremendous value. And this goes back to like, the love letter, sometimes just opening the file and looking at your data with your own eyes versus like what the computer program's going to do, can add a huge amount of value, and give you an understanding of your data that you didn't previously had. But profiling it and just doing, just basic group by statements on different fields will tell you like, how, like, why are we getting complaints? What are the fraud schemes that we're getting hit by? How many new customers do we have? What channel did they come from? How many customers have tried it? And what was the reason why they had tried it? Like almost every data population you can start to build some characteristics on. Mm-hmm. And I think we get really excited about delivering on a hypothesis, and we forget to just like listen to what our data is telling us. So that second one would be, listen to your data and explore it. The third one is, have a good hypothesis when you go in. But be flexible and consider alternate things once you start profiling that data, because, more often than not, once you see that data, you're going to like adjust that hypothesis, and come up with one that's even better than what you started with. And then like, lastly, you articulated it, I think, in kicking the question off too, is like, never lose sight of like the objective of what you're doing and where the risk is, because there's all sorts of amazing like statistics that you can show. There's amazing graphics that you can create, but like if you're not able to like frame it back in a way that connects back to increased risk or operational effectiveness or whatever your objective is, like you may have discovered something that you think is interesting that no one else can figure out why it's interesting, and you're going to be on an uphill battle if that's the situation. So
Yeah.
I think if you focus on those 4 areas, I think you'll have a good shot at, finding some really interesting insights out of data.
That was a lesson learned for me on the objective, because once you get it, it's so easy. If you're familiar enough with any kind of analytics tool, just start what I call just grip it and rip it type analytics. Like, yeah, there's a formal process we follow, and we're going to do these types of analytics, this descriptive stuff, and profiling and outliers, and like we'll follow that script. But then sometimes you just look at it and you go, oh, I wonder if this is the case, and you start playing around with it, and you find something and you go, that has nothing to do. I mean, that's cool, I guess, but nothing to do with why we're looking at this. And so have made it a point, and it's in our methodology like multiple times. What is the objective of this? Because if you don't keep that front and center, then it's super easy to go off the rails. And so we're implementing our methodology with someone, and they're like, didn't we already talk about the objective? And I was like, yep, but we already did all this other stuff. And so you lose focus on the objective. And they went, yeah, I guess, that does make sense. So yeah, it's like 3 times during planning, like, what's the objective? Okay, now do all this stuff. Now what's the objective? So yeah, that is critically important.
Yeah. If you can write your objective, in terms that like also describes the domain of data you're dealing with, like, you're going to be light years ahead. And what I mean by that is like, I can say that I want to do an audit of a fraud department, and I care about, let's just say, fraud risk and fraud loss and the operational expense associated with fraud, right? That starts to identify like, okay, high level, we know what we're doing. If you're able to also say like, and we're going to look at like all of the fraud that occurred in this time window, if you could write that in your like audit plan when you're planning like capital P planning for the year and try to figure out what's cycling, your analysts can start working on getting that population of data. So whether it's all the employees that are on the like active list as of this date, or people that were, either joined or left, or it's accounts payable, like every single one of those, if you can just add a phrase about what that domain is and the scope is, you're going to give your analytical team so much to work with, and give you the opportunity to achieve that first bullet we talked about, which was, how do you have data in advance so that like you hit the ground running from day one? So,
yeah, that's a good point, because I know there's some areas, AP, like, hey, we're going to audit AP for whatever reason this year. And it's what we call desktop data. So I always try to tell people, again, in that trying to acquire data kind of relatively quickly, is, all right, if we're looking at AP, we know we need invoice date, we need amount, we need vendor ID, that stuff. So like, and that's probably sitting on either someone's desktop, or it's easy enough to where they can get it, is where the term desktop data comes from. But if you have like a more specific reason for that, other than just like AP, or that objective speaks to the data domain like you're talking about, then it does give you a leg up and being able to go, okay, now we have a more specific type data request and we know what to go after. We're not going to piss off the data owner as much by going, hey, we need this now. And 2 months later, hey, also, we kind of need this, this, and this, and this, because we know what's going on now. Now that we're
you triggered me with AP, because it's like, you can remember stories of audit teams said, hey, we want to go audit AP, like, do y'all have the data to do that? And having a junior audit analyst say, yeah, we've got all the AP data, and then you get closer to the audit and they're like, yeah, like, we're really focused on like the third party, acquisition process, and like, what's the life cycle for a vendor to get approved to like be providing a service that we have AP for? And then you're like, well, that's a different data domain than like what you talked about as invoices and purchase orders and stuff, right? So having that like additional layer will take away a lot of those like inefficiencies and pain in the process.
We had somebody's doing a vendor audit, and so they were talking to, I think it was a DBA, database administrator, and the DBA was talking about the vendor master table, and then maybe even pulled up a diagram, like a data flow diagram or something, and showed like, hey, this table connects and this one, and and for a vendor, and especially for large organizations like we work with, hundreds of tables could ultimately tie into that. And the auditor went, oh yeah, that's great, like, can I just get all that data? and basically got kicked out of the room. I wasn't in there, but he came back and like we were talking about the data request and all this. He's like, yeah, ask for all the vendor data. And I went, what do you mean all the vendor data? And told me what they said. And I went, you stay here. Let me go talk to that DBA again and explain this, because there's a good chance you're not going to get anything because they just gave you the double birds and went, what are you talking about? No, I'm not going to do that. So anyway, that reminded me of that war story to a degree. All right, I was hoping that we would get a couple of really cool fraud stories. I think you absolutely crushed that. And then me being internal audit and data analytics person that I am, super interested in your background with analytics. And so, usually at this point is where I, selfishly would say, I got everything that I wanted, out of this. I got the cool fraud story and I got your perspective on analytics with internal audit. So it's been fantastic for me, but I do like to give the guest a chance to leave the audience with whatever you want to. So with that said, the floor is yours, Mark. What do you want to leave the audience with?
Yeah, I'm going to just harken back to, how do we protect the elder population that exists? I'm going to put a different lens on this. This is not how you as the company do it. It's if you're in the sandwich generation or you are caring for, a loved one who is in that aging process. I just got a couple pieces of advice here that, might help you fight that battle. One, start talking to them about, fraud schemes and scams now, just to normalize the topic. By the time they become victims, there's so much shame that current day stats say for every elder abuse case that's reported for exploitation, 44 go unreported. So start the process now of discussing it so that it is natural and you can reduce the feeling of shame and despair. Discuss how it's a psychological attack, right? This is something that's they're intending to get a rational person to take unrational actions, and it's a little bit of a psychological attack more than anything else. And highlight what some of those current scams and tactics are. Tactically, go enroll in online banking. Help them do that. If they don't, the criminals will. So they don't have to go use it all the time. It doesn't have to be the primary way they look at their account or engage with it. But set it up so it takes the opportunity away from anyone else to do so. Can't advise enough to have some type of password locker so that you can maintain different passwords for everywhere you do. And then lastly, I would say point them to learning resources. AARP, Department of Justice, almost everyone has, awareness of fraud and scam. It doesn't only have to have elder as the population, because we know they're attacking everyone equally. Encourage them to do their own research. And if you can, set it up in a way that encourages them to bring that information back to you and feel like they're teaching you about it, because that will continue their research and their ability to protect themselves. So hopefully, if we all can lean in and we can all try to, protect this population, we'll do a little bit more for society than we're currently doing today. So with that, I appreciate it. And thank you, Trent.
Hey everyone, thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Audit Podcast. Whatever platform you're listening on right now, I'm sure there's a subscribe button somewhere, so please hit the subscribe button there. If you're listening through iTunes or Spotify, feel free to go give us that 5-star rating. It only took me about 16 seconds to give myself a 5-star review, and it really helps to get future guests to come on the show, so we'd really appreciate that. Lastly, be sure to check out the show notes and follow us on all our social media channels on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and on TikTok. Also, if interested, please sign up for our weekly newsletter from the Audit Podcast. Thank you all. Have a great one.